On the dusty steps of the Chalca Gate in Constantinople, where the roaring life of the world's capital fades before the majesty of the imperial palace, an old man sits. His figure is a fragment of an ancient statue, eroded by time and grief. His eye sockets are empty, scorched not by old age, but, as rumor whispers, by red-hot iron. His hand, which once gripped the hilt of a sword that redrew the map of the world and returned lost continents to Rome, is now outstretched in a silent plea. In this hand is a wooden begging bowl. From the lips that once gave orders to legions and dictated terms to kings, only a quiet, cracked whisper escapes. A whisper that has become a legend, a curse, and an epitaph for an entire era. Date obolum Belisario. Give an obol to Belisarius. This sight, this image seared into the memory of centuries, is our central question, our unsolvable paradox. How? How could a man who crushed the Vandals and the Goths, who returned Africa and Italy to the empire, who saved his emperor's throne from the fury of a revolt, end his life here in humiliating darkness, begging for alms from the very citizens he once protected? Why did the Emperor Justinian, to whom he gifted a world and the dream of former glory, repay him with such monstrous ingratitude? This question is not merely a historical riddle. It is a tragedy of loyalty and betrayal, of shining glory and the all-consuming shadow of paranoia that always lurks behind the glitter of an imperial throne. To find the answer, we must return to the very beginning, to a world standing on the breaking point of ages, a world that desperately needed a hero, not yet knowing the price it would have to pay for his arrival. The story of Belisarius is not a biography. It is an autopsy of the eternal conflict between genius and power. His end was not decided on the day he was blinded, but at the very moment his fame began to shine brighter than the light of the emperor's crown. To understand how such a titan as Belisarius was born and destroyed, one must first breathe the dusty, blood and incense-stained air of his era, the dawn of the 6th century AD. It was a phantom world, a fractured world. The Western Roman Empire, the colossus that had held civilization on its shoulders for 1,000 years, had collapsed less than half a century before. Its bones, the roads, the aqueducts, the cities, were now gnawed upon by barbarian kingdoms. The Vandals in wealthy Africa, the Ostrogoths in sacred Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul. Rome, the eternal city, had become a provincial arena for barbarian warlords. But in the east, in Constantinople, the new Rome, the old empire still breathed. Byzantium, as historians would later call it, saw itself as the one true heir of Caesar and Augustus. It was a world of contrasts. Silk and gold glittered on the capital's streets. Complex theological debates raged over the nature of Christ. Yet just a few days' march from its walls lay wild steppes from which hordes of Huns and Slavs descended in waves. The greatest threat in the east was the eternal rival, Sasanian Persia, the other superpower of the ancient world, with whom the empire waged an endless, exhausting war for control of the Caucasus and Mesopotamia. And onto the throne of this world, full of danger and great hope, ascended Emperor Justinian. A man not of noble blood, the nephew of a common soldier, he was obsessed with a grandiose, almost insane dream. Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the restoration of the Roman Empire. He saw himself as a new Constantine, a new Augustus, and to achieve this dream, he needed a tool, a sword capable of crushing his enemies and reclaiming what was lost. He needed a general the world had not seen since the time of Trajan, and fate gave him such a man. But Justinian, obsessed with restoring imperial majesty, could not foresee that the shadow of his own general would one day become more terrifying to him than any barbarian king or Persian shah. In this world of glittering aristocracy and entrenched dynasties, Belisarius was a nobody. He was born around the year 500 in a lost village called Germania, somewhere in the wild, forested lands of Thrace or Illyria, the Balkans, which had for centuries supplied Rome with its best soldiers and its harshest emperors. Not a drop of blue blood ran in his veins. He was not the scion of a senatorial family whose ancestors had sat with Augustus. He was a son of the earth, a product of the harsh frontier, where survival depended not on elegance of speech, but on the strength of one's arm and the quickness of one's mind. This simple, barbarian origin became the key to his destiny. On the one hand, it made him a permanent outsider at the Constantinopolitan court, where the nobility would always look down on him as an upstart, a lucky soldier. He had no one to rely on but his own talent. But on the other hand, this also made him the ideal candidate for an emperor like Justinian, who himself was not from the ancient nobility and was suspicious of the old aristocratic clans. Justinian saw in Belisarius the pure embodiment of meritocracy, a man who owed everything personally to him, the emperor. Belisarius had no powerful relatives who could plot conspiracies, no hereditary rights that could cast a shadow on the throne. His only support, his only god on earth, was the emperor. This dependence, it seemed, guaranteed absolute loyalty. And Belisarius was loyal, absurdly, selflessly loyal. But this very relationship, I created you, and I can destroy you, held the seeds of the future tragedy. The emperor, having created his perfect servant from dust, could never truly believe that his creation would not one day desire to take the creator's place. The origin of Belisarius, which was the key to his rise, also became the weight that would, in the end, drag him to the bottom. Unlike Alexander the Great, whose birth was supposedly marked by omens, or Caesar, who traced his lineage to the goddess Venus, no myths or prophecies are associated with the birth of Belisarius. The chronicles are silent about comets in the sky or his mother's dreams. His arrival in the world was as quiet and unnoticed as that of any other peasant boy on the empire's outskirts. However, his life, his very career, when viewed from the heights of history, looks like one continuous prophecy. He was a man who appeared at the exact moment he was needed most, as if history itself, tired of a succession of mediocre generals and indecisive politicians, had decided to reveal its final masterpiece of Roman military genius. His rise was so swift, his victories so unbelievable, that his contemporaries could not help but see the hand of God in it. In an age where every event, from a drought to a military defeat, was interpreted as a manifestation of divine will, Belisarius's successes seemed miraculous. He was the David who time and again defeated Goliaths, the massive Persian army, the invincible Vandal fleet, the numberless Gothic hordes. To the common soldiers and citizens of the empire, he was not just a general, but a living sign, proof that God had not abandoned Rome and that the glory of their ancestors could be revived. This perception of him as a man of destiny, an instrument of providence, created an aura of sanctity around him that was both his greatest asset and a hidden threat. For in Byzantine political theology, only one man on earth could be considered God's chosen, the emperor. When a subject's successes begin to look like a series of miracles, it inevitably casts a shadow on the figure of God's anointed one on the throne. Justinian himself may have initially believed that Belisarius was sent to him by heaven to carry out his great plans. But over time, the divine radiance surrounding his general began to blind the emperor's own eyes, transforming in his mind from a sign of favor into an omen of danger. The forge that hammered out the unique character and unsurpassed military talent of Belisarius was not the capital's academies or quiet libraries, but the harsh, blood and sweat-soaked reality of the Roman frontier service. As a very young man, like thousands of other strong youths from the Balkans, he joined the army, which became his home, his school, and his only path for advancement. He began his career in the Sholai, the elite guard units, and quickly caught the attention of his superiors with his courage, physical strength, and far more rarely, his sharp, analytical mind. He served on the Danube frontier, under constant threat from raids by Huns, Slavs, and Bulgars. This was not the warfare of textbooks, of parade ground drills and neat formations. It was a brutal, asymmetrical war of small detachments, ambushes, sudden raids, and exhausting pursuits. Here, Belisarius learned the tactics of the barbarians firsthand, their strengths and weaknesses. He understood that against their swift cavalry charges, the classic Roman heavy infantry was no longer as effective. He realized the value of mobility, reconnaissance, and deception. Unlike many Roman commanders, raised to despise barbarians, he did not disdain their methods, but borrowed and perfected them. He learned to think like them in order to anticipate their moves. It was on the frontier that he began to form the core of his future elite troops, the Bucellarii, training them to wield not only the sword and spear, but also the bow, firing from horseback as skillfully as any Hunnic rider. This experience, gained far from palace intrigues, forged in him the character of a true soldier, straightforward, prizing discipline and loyalty, accustomed to solving problems with action, not words. But this same soldierly straightforwardness and his lack of experience in the art of Byzantine flattery and subterfuge would later make him vulnerable in the snake pit of the Constantinopolitan court, where victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the silence of the corridors. The first thunderclap, announcing the birth of a new military genius, was the Battle of Dara. This was not just another border skirmish, but a pitched battle, a true trial by fire for the young general, whom Justinian had, for the first time, entrusted with command of an entire army. Facing him were the best forces of Sasanian Persia, an empire that had been Rome's only worthy rival for centuries. The Persian army, numbering between 40 and 50,000 warriors, including their famed immortal heavy cavalry, significantly outnumbered Belisarius's corps of 25,000. Any other general in his place would have retreated or settled into a deep defense. But Belisarius did the unthinkable. Instead of passively awaiting the attack, he turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. By his command, the Romans dug a complex system of trenches and ditches in front of their line. This was not just a hole, but an ingenious trap that hampered the Persian cavalry, funneling their attacks into narrow, pre-sighted corridors where they were met with a devastating hail of arrows from Roman archers and infantry. When the Persian commander, confident in his numerical superiority, threw his troops into the attack, they became entangled in this defensive web. Belisarius, using a feigned retreat on one flank, lured a portion of the Persian cavalry into an ambush and annihilated it with a hidden reserve. The battle turned into a slaughter. The Persians were utterly routed, losing thousands of their best soldiers. The victory at Dara was not just a tactical success, it was a revolution in the art of war. Belisarius proved that a flexible mind and superior strategy could defeat brute force. His fame spread throughout the empire. He became a hero, the man who had beaten the unbeatable Persians. But it was here, in the rays of his first great triumph, that he, without realizing it, took the first step toward his future tragedy. Justinian had his victor, but with him, he also had a potential rival for the love of the army and the people. What truly drove this man? Was it an unquenchable thirst for glory, like the one that consumed Alexander? Or the cold calculation and drive for supreme power, as with Caesar? Analyzing the actions of Belisarius, especially at the critical moments of his life, we come to a paradoxical conclusion. His primary, almost fanatical motivation was a virtue that is the most dangerous in the world of high politics: absolute, uncompromising loyalty. This was not just loyalty to a specific man, Justinian. It was a deep, almost religious devotion to the very idea of the Roman Empire, eternal and indivisible, and to its legitimate representative on earth, the emperor. For Belisarius, the simple Thracian raised from nothing, the emperor was not just a ruler, but a living symbol of order, law, and civilization in a world of chaos. Serving him was the highest duty, the meaning of existence. This soldier's psychology, ingrained in him since youth, defined all his actions. When the Goths in Italy offered him the imperial crown of the West, an offer no other ambitious man would have refused, he rejected it without hesitation, considering the very thought a betrayal. He genuinely believed that in reconquering lands, he was merely fulfilling his master's will, and he could imagine no reward other than his approval. Herein lay his inner demon, his tragic flaw. He was a brilliant general, but a naive politician. He judged the world of the court by the laws of a military camp, where loyalty is valued above all. He could not understand that in the eyes of a paranoid autocrat like Justinian, such boundless loyalty and stunning success do not inspire gratitude. They breed fear. The emperor could not believe in the existence of a man who possessed such power and popularity, but did not desire more. He searched Belisarius for secret motives, for hidden ambitions, and finding none, only became more convinced of his cunning. Belisarius was too perfect a servant for an imperfect world, and his loyalty, which he considered his shield, turned out to be the very sword that ultimately pierced him. The victories of Belisarius would have been impossible without the unique military instrument he created and honed to perfection: his personal guard, known as the Bucellarii. These were not mere mercenaries or regular soldiers. They were a brotherhood of arms, bound to their general by ties of personal loyalty that went far beyond ordinary military discipline. The word Bucellarius came from the Latin bucellatum, meaning biscuit or hardtack, that is, he who eats his master's bread. And they did eat his bread, but they paid for it with their blood and unswerving devotion. Belisarius recruited the best of the best into his guard, paying no attention to their origins. There were Romans, Greeks, Goths, Huns, Persians, the elite of the barbarian and Roman worlds. He paid them a generous salary from his personal funds and equipped them with the best weapons and armor. Unlike the standard imperial army, his Bucellarii were universal soldiers. They were heavily armored horsemen capable of a devastating charge, like Persian cataphracts, but they were also virtuosos with the bow, showering the enemy with a cloud of arrows from horseback, like the Huns. This tactical flexibility allowed Belisarius to dominate the battlefield, adapting to any opponent. The number of his personal guard at times reached 7,000 men, a full-fledged private army, the elite special forces of the 6th century, loyal not to the abstract empire, but to him personally. And therein lay the duality of their existence. For Belisarius, they were the key to his victories. For his soldiers, they were an example to emulate. But for Justinian and Constantinople, these 7,000 loyal blades were a source of growing anxiety. An army sworn not to the throne, but to a man, is the nightmare of any ruler. The emperor understood that the force that conquered kingdoms for him today could storm his own palace tomorrow. And so, in striking at Belisarius, Justinian would always aim first at his Bucellarii, seeking to disband them, to strip his general of his most reliable support and his most formidable power. Before Belisarius set out to reclaim the lost provinces, fate threw a far more terrible and important test at him, right in the heart of the empire, in Constantinople. The Nika revolt erupted in the capital, the bloodiest and most destructive riot in its history. It all began at the Hippodrome, which was not just a place for chariot races, but the political center of the city, where the populace could directly express its sympathies and grievances. The two main factions of fans, the Blues and the Greens, longtime rivals, suddenly united against Justinian's unpopular government, furious over high taxes and official corruption. Their racing cheer, "Nika! Conquer!" became a roar of rebellion. The mob, numbering in the tens of thousands, rampaged through the city for days, burning down key buildings, including the Hagia Sophia Cathedral. Justinian lost control of the capital. The rebels proclaimed a new emperor, Hypatius, the nephew of a former ruler. The situation seemed hopeless. Justinian, trapped in his palace, was already preparing to flee. It was at this critical moment that three people turned the tide of history. The Empress Theodora, a former actress with an iron will, gave her famous speech, declaring that purple is a fine shroud, and it was better to die an empress than to live as an exile. Her words put courage back into the despairing Justinian, and then Belisarius took action. Along with another general, Mundus, he was given the order to act. This was not a battle on an open field. It was a brutal police operation. Belisarius, with his loyal Bucalarii and Gothic mercenaries, stormed the Hippodrome, where the main mass of unarmed rebels had gathered, and unleashed a monstrous massacre. On that day, according to chroniclers, over 30,000 people were killed in the arena and its surroundings. The rebellion was drowned in blood. Belisarius had saved Justinian's throne. He had not conquered a new province. He had saved the empire itself. But this victory had a dark side. Justinian was saved, but he was also humiliated, having seen his power hang by a thread, dependent on the will of a single general. From that day on, he owed Belisarius not just his throne, but his life. And monarchs rarely forgive such a debt. The savior of the emperor became his eternal silent reproach, the man who had seen him in his moment of greatest weakness. After this bloody baptism in the fires of the Nika revolt, Justinian decided to direct the energy and popularity of his savior outward, far from the capital. The first target was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. It was a tempting prize, the richest province, the breadbasket of Rome, lost for almost 100 years. However, the task seemed almost impossible. The Vandals were not just barbarians. They possessed a powerful fleet that controlled the entire Western Mediterranean. The expedition looked like a gamble, and many in Constantinople predicted its failure. Belisarius was given only 15,000 soldiers, a ridiculously small force to conquer an entire continent. But what followed was entered into the annals of military history as a textbook example of a brilliant blitzkrieg. The Byzantine fleet landed in Africa. Belisarius immediately demonstrated not only his military, but also his political genius. He strictly forbade his soldiers from looting the local Romano-African population, declaring that they came as liberators, not as conquerors. This secured him the support and loyalty of the local people. The Vandal king, Gelimer, made a fatal mistake. He divided his forces, sending his best troops to suppress a revolt on Sardinia. Belisarius seized the opportunity. In two decisive battles, at Ad Decimum and Tricamarum, he routed the Vandal army, using his favorite tactic, a combination of swift, horse-archer attacks and a decisive heavy cavalry charge. In less than 6 months, the Vandal kingdom, which had existed for a century, ceased to exist. Gelimer was captured, and their vast treasures were seized. Belisarius returned to Constantinople and was granted an honor that no private citizen of Rome had seen in 500 years. He celebrated a full triumph, parading through the streets of the capital with captured spoils and a captive king. He was on top of the world. The people worshipped him. But on the imperial tribunal, Justinian, while applauding his general, perhaps for the first time, felt the icy touch of fear. The man standing before him was too great. His glory shone too brightly. While Belisarius was winning victories on the battlefield, his fate was being largely decided in the gilded chambers of the imperial palace, in a world ruled not by swords, but by whispers, intrigues, and poison. And the key figures on this chessboard were two women, bound by complex and contradictory ties, the Empress Theodora and Belisarius's wife, Antonina. Theodora, a former dancer and courtesan who possessed an iron grip and a sharp political mind, was not just Justinian's wife, she was his co-ruler. She had enormous influence over state affairs and ruthlessly eliminated anyone she considered a threat to her position or her husband's power. Antonina, Belisarius's wife, was her closest friend, confidant, and, in essence, her agent. Their friendship was sealed by a shared low-born origin and years spent in the harsh world of the Constantinopolitan underworld. This connection gave Antonina immense power and protection, but it also made her and Belisarius hostages to the Empress's whims and suspicions. Antonina was an ambitious, domineering woman, and, according to malicious tongues, like the historian Procopius, unfaithful to her husband. She accompanied Belisarius on all his campaigns, but her main mission was to keep an unofficial watch over him for Theodora. Any careless word from the general, any gesture that could be interpreted as disloyalty, immediately became known to the Empress. Belisarius was thus under double pressure. On the battlefield, he fought the enemies of the empire, while in his own tent, he lived under the sleepless eye of a court representative, his own wife. This complex dynamic created constant tension. Theodora, on the one hand, could protect Belisarius from other court plotters, but on the other, it was her suspicion and jealous guarding of his growing fame that fueled Justinian's paranoia. The genius of war found himself a pawn in a complex game played by women, where the stakes were higher than the crowns of barbarian kings. His very life and honor were on the line. Intoxicated by the easy victory in Africa, Justinian turned his gaze to the main prize of his dream, Italy, the heart of the old empire, the cradle of Roman civilization, now under the rule of the Ostrogoths. Using the murder of the pro-Byzantine queen Amalasuntha as a pretext, he ordered Belisarius to begin the invasion. It seemed that this campaign, too, would be quick and victorious. The Goths were weakened by internal strife, and the Italic population was expected to greet the imperial troops as liberators. The beginning was indeed promising. Belisarius easily captured Sicily, and then, crossing to the mainland, took Naples, and finally, Rome itself, with little resistance. Imperial standards once again flew over the Eternal City. For Justinian, this was the moment of his reign's greatest triumph, but the euphoria was short-lived. The Goths, recovering from the initial shock, rallied around a new, energetic king, Witiges. They gathered a massive army, by some accounts up to 150,000 men, and marched on Rome. What had begun as a campaign of liberation turned into a brutal, protracted war of attrition, one that would last for nearly 20 years and turn blooming Italy into a scorched wasteland. It was here, in Italy, that Belisarius faced the most serious challenge of his career. He found himself trapped in a huge city with a garrison of only 5,000 men against a vastly superior enemy. He had to fight not only the Goths, but also hunger, disease, and despair among his soldiers and the people of Rome. The Italian campaign became the crossroads of his fate. It raised his fame to unprecedented heights, but it also sowed the very seeds of mistrust and envy in Constantinople that would later bear poisonous fruit. The Gothic siege of Rome, which lasted for a year and 9 days, became the pinnacle of Belisarius's military genius and the apogee of his fame. It was an epic duel of David and Goliath, one that has entered all textbooks of military history. Against his 5,000-man garrison, the Goths fielded an army that was, by the most conservative estimates, 30 times larger. They surrounded the city, cut all the aqueducts, depriving Rome of water, and began relentless assaults. The situation seemed utterly hopeless. But it was in such desperate situations that Belisarius's talent shone brightest. He was everywhere, personally directing the defense on the walls, organizing sorties, and inspiring the disheartened soldiers and citizens. His engineering genius was on full display. He turned the mausoleums of Augustus and Hadrian into impregnable fortresses and ordered the famous classical statues on top of them to be broken and thrown down onto the heads of the attackers. When the Goths built giant siege towers, he used ballistae to kill the oxen pulling them, immobilizing the machines. He was not just a general, he was the soul of the defense. The historian Procopius, an eyewitness to these events, describes how Belisarius, clad in armor, would appear at the most dangerous sections, and his mere presence would double the defenders' strength. He managed to hold out for over a year, exhausting the massive Gothic army in fruitless attacks until long-awaited reinforcements finally arrived. Lifting the siege of Rome turned Belisarius into a living legend. His name thundered across the Mediterranean. He was the savior of the eternal city, a new Camillus. In the eyes of the army and the people, he was no longer just the emperor's servant, but a force in his own right, a demigod of war. And it was this status, won in the battles for Rome, that made him mortally dangerous in the eyes of his own master. The peak of Belisarius's power became the beginning of his slow, inexorable fall. He did not yet know that while he was defending the walls of Rome from the Goths, he was simultaneously tearing down the invisible walls of trust between himself and his emperor. In the midst of the grueling Italian war, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage, an event occurred that would become a fatal test of Belisarius's loyalty. The Goths, exhausted by the war and awed by the military genius of their opponent, concluded they could not defeat him in battle. And so, they made him an offer that, in their minds, was impossible to refuse. Through their ambassadors, they proposed that Belisarius end the war and accept the title of Emperor of the Western Roman Empire. They were prepared to swear fealty to him, to become his army, and to recognize him as their lawful ruler. This was the moment of truth. A dizzying prospect opened before Belisarius. He could become a new Augustus, restoring the empire in the West under his own scepter. All of Italy, the entire army, both Gothic and a significant part of the Byzantine force, would be at his feet. Any other man in his place, driven by ambition, would have seized this chance. But Belisarius was forged from a different metal. His loyalty to Justinian, as we have said, was absolute, almost irrational. He saw this offer not as an opportunity, but as an insult, an attempt to buy his honor. However, being a cunning strategist, he decided to use the situation to his advantage. He pretended to accept the Goths' proposal to lull their suspicions. Under the pretext of negotiating his coronation, he entered their impregnable capital, Ravenna, with his troops, and as soon as the gates closed behind him, he declared the city the property of Emperor Justinian, and the Gothic king, Witiges, his prisoner. From a military perspective, it was a brilliant move, allowing him to end the war, as it then seemed, without a fight. But from a political standpoint, it was a catastrophe. Rumors of the Goths' offer, even though it was rejected, flew to Constantinople. To the paranoid mind of Justinian and his court, the very fact that such negotiations took place was proof of treason. They did not believe in his loyalty. They saw only one thing. Their general was so popular and powerful that his enemies were offering him a crown. And this fear proved stronger than the gratitude for a war won. Justinian's reaction to Belisarius's triumphant conclusion of the first phase of the Gothic War was cold and revealing. Instead of showering the general with honors, the emperor, poisoned by the reports of his rivals and his own suspicions, immediately recalled him from Italy. The official pretext was the need for his presence in the east, where the Persians had resumed hostilities. But the true reason was obvious to everyone at court. Justinian feared Belisarius. He feared his fame, his popularity with the soldiers, his authority among the conquered Goths. The emperor could not allow a new center of power to arise in distant Italy, a potential Western emperor, even if that man swore loyalty. This recall was the first deep humiliation for Belisarius, the first bitter taste of imperial ingratitude. He was torn from his life's work at the moment of decisive success, not allowed to complete the pacification of Italy. Upon arriving in Constantinople, he received no new triumph, not even warm thanks. Instead, he was met with the cold, probing stares of the courtiers. Justinian was sending him a message. Your victories are my victories, and your fame is a temporary privilege that I can revoke at any moment. This episode became the turning point in their relationship. Trust, if it ever existed, had finally evaporated. Belisarius understood that his main enemy was not on the battlefield, but behind his back in the imperial palace. Justinian, in turn, was convinced that a man like Belisarius could not be left in command of a victorious army, far from the capital, for long. He was too effective, too successful, and therefore too dangerous. From this moment on, the emperor would keep his best general on a short leash, now pulling him close, now pushing him away, using his talent in moments of crisis and sending him into the shadows as soon as the danger passed. It was a slow, agonizing political execution, drawn out over decades. In the shadow of Belisarius's colossal figure, another, entirely opposite personality was rising and gaining strength at the Constantinopolitan court, the eunuch Narses. If Belisarius was a man of the field, a soldier to the core, Narses was a genius of the corridors, a master of intrigue, and an unsurpassed administrator. As a eunuch, he could not found his own dynasty, which, in the eyes of the suspicious Justinian, made him a much safer and more manageable figure. Narses, who held the post of chief treasurer, wielded enormous influence and had the emperor's ear. He hated Belisarius with the quiet but lethal hatred that a court politician often feels for a popular military commander. He saw him as a crude soldier, an upstart whose fame overshadowed everyone else. Justinian, masterfully playing on their rivalry, began to actively use Narses as a counterweight to Belisarius. Even during the first Italian campaign, he had sent Narses to Italy with reinforcements, but with powers equal to those of Belisarius. This immediately led to a split in the command. Narses, lacking military experience, but leaning on his authority at court, challenged Belisarius's decisions, sabotaged his orders, and lured other commanders to his side. This divided command nearly led to a military disaster and the loss of all that had been won. Although Narses was eventually recalled, this episode showed Belisarius that the emperor no longer trusted him alone. Narses became a permanent shadow, an alternative that Justinian always kept in reserve. It would be he, not Belisarius, who would be sent to finish the Gothic War many years later. And to the surprise of many, he would prove to be a talented commander, achieving the final victory. The rivalry between these two men, the straightforward warrior and the cunning courtier, was not just a personal conflict. It was a clash of two worlds, two approaches to serving the empire, and ultimately, in the system of Byzantine autocracy, the cautious and politically flexible Narses proved to be more agreeable to the throne than the brilliant and independent Belisarius. After several years spent in disfavor and on minor posts on the Persian frontier, Belisarius was summoned back to Italy. The Goths, under the new and energetic King Totila, had launched a counter-offensive and reconquered almost all the lost territories, including Rome. The empire's position in Italy was catastrophic. Justinian, reluctantly, was forced to turn once again to the only man capable of fixing the situation. But this time, everything was different. The emperor, still distrusting his general, sent him to Italy with virtually no army and no money. This was not just a mission. It was a sophisticated humiliation, a test of endurance. Justinian seemed to be saying, "You think you're a genius? Then show me what you can do with a handful of men and an empty purse." Belisarius found himself in an impossibly difficult position. He had to literally create an army on the fly, hiring mercenaries with his own remaining personal funds, begging local imperial officials for help. He was a shadow of the triumphal conqueror who had once subdued Africa and taken Rome. Now he was fighting a desperate guerrilla war, avoiding major battles, trying to wear down the enemy with small skirmishes. He tried several times to retake Rome, but failed each time due to a lack of forces. This second Italian campaign became a period of his greatest humiliation and frustration. He watched as the fruits of his past victories turned to dust, and he was powerless to change it. He wrote desperate letters to Constantinople, begging for soldiers and money, but received only silence or empty promises. Justinian was deliberately sabotaging him, unwilling to let him win another resounding victory. The emperor did not want a triumph for Belisarius. He merely wanted the front stabilized by his hands. In the end, exhausted and disillusioned, Belisarius himself asked to be relieved. He returned to Constantinople not as a conqueror, but as a failure, a man whose reputation his own emperor had successfully destroyed. Against the backdrop of military setbacks and political intrigue, a catastrophe of apocalyptic proportions struck the empire: the Justinian plague. The pandemic, which arrived from Egypt, spread throughout the Mediterranean with horrifying speed. It was the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, and its consequences were monstrous. According to contemporaries, at the epidemic's peak, up to 10,000 people were dying each day in Constantinople alone. There was no time to bury the dead. Bodies were piled in towers or simply left in the streets. Cities emptied, agriculture collapsed, trade ground to a halt. The empire was plunged into a darkness of terror and despair. The plague spared no one, rich or poor. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill. He was on the brink of death, and for a time, chaos reigned in the empire. It was in this moment of universal horror that the court's suspicion of Belisarius reached its peak. While the emperor lay delirious, courtiers and generals began to quietly discuss the matter of succession. Belisarius, who was on the Persian front at the time, allegedly stated, according to informants, that he would not support any emperor chosen in Constantinople without the army's consent. Perhaps these were merely the words of a soldier wanting to ensure stability, but to the ears of the recovering and terrified Justinian, they were fed as proof of a conspiracy. Empress Theodora immediately summoned Belisarius and another general to the capital for interrogation. Although there was no direct evidence of treason, the shadow of suspicion grew even darker. The atmosphere of universal death that permeated the empire only intensified the paranoia. In a world where life had become so fragile and the future so uncertain, any potential threat to power was perceived 100 times more sharply. The plague not only claimed the lives of millions of Justinian's subjects, it also poisoned his soul, making him even more suspicious and cruel toward the one man who could possibly take his place. Despite all the hardships of the Second Italian campaign, Belisarius had once again demonstrated his genius for tactical cunning. The culmination of that period was the capture of the Gothic capital, Ravenna, before his first recall. The city, surrounded by impenetrable marshes, seemed invincible. Realizing that a direct assault would lead to enormous losses, Belisarius, as we mentioned, resorted to a risky deception, pretending to accept the Goths' offer to make him Emperor of the West. This maneuver allowed him to take possession of the city and capture King Witiges without a fight. However, when he returned to Constantinople with the captive king and the keys to the Gothic capital, he was met not with triumph and gratitude, but with a wall of cold alienation. Justinian and his court could not forgive him even the appearance of negotiations for a crown. His success, achieved not by force of arms, but by the power of his intellect and authority, frightened them even more. They saw in him not a loyal servant, but a dangerous politician, capable of manipulating enemies, and perhaps in the future, his own people. This event became his point of no return. Immediately after, a new, even deeper humiliation followed. After an informant's report on his conduct during Justinian's illness, he was subjected to true disgrace. His vast fortune, accumulated over years of war and including trophies from the Vandal and Gothic kingdoms, was confiscated. But the most painful blow was the disbandment of his personal guard. His loyal bucellari, who had been through fire and water with him, were taken from him and distributed among other generals and court eunuchs. Justinian was methodically pulling out his fangs and claws, robbing him not only of his wealth, but of his main support, his loyal men. It was a public humiliation, a signal to the whole world that the star of Belisarius had set. He was reduced from the greatest general to a simple officer, dependent on the emperor's mercy. Psychologically, it was a crushing blow, a precursor to the final fall that would end in the legend of a blind beggar. Stripped of his wealth and his personal army, Belisarius nonetheless remained too valuable a military specialist to be simply written off. When war with Persia flared up again on the eastern border, Justinian, having no generals of equal caliber at hand, was forced to use his services once more. Belisarius was sent to Mesopotamia, but this was no longer the all-powerful commander of before. He operated under strict control from the capital, his initiative fettered, his resources limited. Nevertheless, even in these conditions, he demonstrated his class. Instead of engaging in major battles with the superior forces of the Persian Shah, Khosrow, he waged a skillful war of maneuver, exhausting the enemy, striking suddenly at his supply lines, and forcing him to retreat without a pitched battle. He saved the eastern provinces from devastation, proving his indispensability yet again. However, his former glory did not return. These campaigns in the east were successful, but not spectacular. They involved no thunderous victories, no captured capitals, or captive kings. He was acting as a skilled crisis manager, putting out fires that others had started. For the court and for history, he was transforming from a shining hero-conqueror into a simple, albeit very competent, general. This period of his service was a time of slow fading. He still served the empire, but without his former enthusiasm, with the cold professionalism of a man who knows he will receive no gratitude for his work. He was a tool, drawn from its scabbard when a threat arose, and hidden away again as soon as the danger passed. It was an agonizing state for a man of his stature, to be a living legend, yet possess no real power or trust, fulfilling his duty while knowing that his every success only deepened his master's suspicion. An event occurred that drastically changed the political landscape of the Byzantine Empire and indirectly affected the fate of Belisarius. The Empress Theodora died. For 21 years, she had been not just Justinian's wife, but his closest advisor, his co-ruler, and perhaps the only person he truly feared and respected. Her influence on state affairs was immense, possessing a sharp mind, political acumen, and absolute ruthlessness. She was the gray cardinal of the empire, managing a complex web of espionage and intrigue. Her attitude toward Belisarius had always been twofold. On the one hand, like Justinian, she saw him as a potential threat. It was she who had been behind the first investigation into his activities during the emperor's illness. On the other hand, her friend and agent was Belisarius's wife, Antonina, which gave Theodora a degree of control over the general. It is possible that while she was alive, her pragmatism and understanding of realpolitik served as a check on the most extreme manifestations of Justinian's paranoia. She understood Belisarius's value to the state. With her death, the emperor lost not only his wife, but also a crucial support and a corrective mechanism. Aging, tormented by illness and religious manias, Justinian became even more suspicious, even more withdrawn and unpredictable. The balance of power at court was shattered. Now, nothing restrained his fears of any show of independence or popularity. Belisarius, having lost even the dubious, yet influential patronage he had through his wife, was left one-on-one with the unlimited power and growing paranoia of his monarch. Theodora's death opened the final, darkest chapter of his life, making his fall all but inevitable. Years passed. Belisarius lived a quiet life of retirement in Constantinople, honored but forgotten. It seemed his heroic era was definitively over. But fate had one last, final bow in store for him. A terrifying new threat fell upon the empire. A horde of Kutrigur nomads, having crossed the frozen Danube on the ice, invaded the Balkans, and, sweeping away everything in their path, advanced to the very walls of Constantinople. Panic gripped the capital. The regular army was far away, in Italy and the east. The city was defended only by a small garrison and the palace guard. Justinian, now in his 70s, was at a loss. And then, everyone remembered the old, forgotten hero. Belisarius was already nearing 60, a very old man by the standards of the time. But the emperor summoned him from retirement and entrusted him with organizing the defense. Belisarius had no army. All he could gather were 300 of his old veteran bucellari and a mob of city militia, armed with whatever they could find. But even with this force, he performed a miracle. Using his incomparable tactical experience, he set an ambush in a narrow defile. He ordered the militia to make as much noise and dust as possible, creating the illusion of a large approaching army. The Kutrigurs, deceived by this ruse, fell into the trap and were attacked on the flank by his 300 veterans. The charge was so fierce and unexpected that the barbarian horde, thousands strong, fled in panic. Belisarius had saved Constantinople one last time. When he returned to the city, he was hailed as a savior. Crowds of people cheered him ecstatically, chanting his name. This sudden, uncontrolled explosion of popular love was his undoing. The old Justinian, watching from his palace, saw not the salvation of his capital, but the triumph of his eternal rival. Gratitude in his soul instantly gave way to black envy and fear. The final feat of Belisarius was the final straw that broke the camel's back of the emperor's paranoia. The old general's triumph was short-lived. Just a few months after his victory over the Kutrigurs, another conspiracy against the emperor was uncovered at court. This time, charges were brought against a group of high-ranking officials, and during interrogation under torture, one of them incriminated Belisarius, naming him as a participant in the plot. Was there even a shred of truth in this accusation? Almost certainly not. Belisarius had, throughout his entire life, proven his unwavering loyalty dozens of times. Besides, as a very old man, he was hardly scheming to overthrow the monarch he had served his entire life. It was, most likely, a perfectly staged performance, the last and decisive attack by his enemies at court, who had long awaited the chance to finally destroy him. And this time, the aging and paranoid Justinian was ready to believe the most absurd slanders. For him, it was a convenient pretext to rid himself of a man whose fame, newly rekindled after the recent victory, had become unbearable to him. The charge of high treason was the final act in a long drama of mistrust and fear. It was betrayal in its most cynical form. The emperor, who owed Belisarius his life, his throne, and the glory of his reign, was now preparing to condemn him as a traitor. The trial was a formality. Despite the absence of any credible evidence, Belisarius was found guilty. It was not justice, but a reprisal, the completion of a long journey of humiliations that had begun back in Italy. The emperor, who did not dare to execute his most famous subject, found another way to destroy him, by breaking his spirit and dragging his name through the mud. The last great Roman stood before his emperor's court, and his fate was sealed not by evidence, but by the years of envy burning in his master's soul. The sentence handed down to Belisarius became the culmination of his tragedy and gave birth to one of the most powerful and enduring legends in history. Although most modern historians agree that the physical blinding of Belisarius is most likely a myth that arose in later centuries, his real punishment was no less cruel and humiliating. He was sentenced to house arrest. His palace was put under guard. He was stripped of all his servants and forbidden from communicating with the outside world. For several months, he was a prisoner in his own home, completely isolated, immersed in silence and oblivion. For a man of action, accustomed to commanding armies and deciding the fate of nations, this was tantamount to death. Justinian did not gouge out his eyes with hot iron, but he blinded him politically and socially. He erased him from the life of the empire, turning him into a living ghost. After some time, perhaps ashamed of his actions or convinced of the general's complete harmlessness, Justinian pardoned Belisarius and returned his property and freedom. But the blow had already been struck. The general's honor was stained, his spirit broken. He was rehabilitated, but not restored to his former glory. And it was this injustice, this grotesque mismatch between his service and his final fate, that so captured the imagination of posterity. The public's imagination was not satisfied with a prosaic house arrest. It demanded a more vivid, more tragic symbol, and so it created one, transforming political blinding into physical blinding and disgrace into a beggar's pouch. The legend proved stronger and truer than the historical fact, because it perfectly reflected the essence of what happened. The emperor, to whom Belisarius had given the light of glory, in return, plunged him into darkness. It is at this point, where documented history ends and the realm of myth begins, that we find the deepest answer to our central question. The legend of the blind Belisarius, begging for alms, is not a historical error, but a popular verdict. It is a poetic truth that proved more powerful than the prose of real events. Why did this story arise and take root in the centuries with such force? Because it gave a simple, clear, and frighteningly plausible explanation for the paradox of his fate. For the common person, for the soldier, for the citizen, it was unthinkable that a hero could be treated this way. to explain it with complex political intrigues, an emperor's paranoia, the envy of courtiers. This was too complicated. It was far simpler and more understandable to frame this tragedy in the form of a classical drama about pride and punishment, about virtue and ingratitude. The image of the blind beggar became an eternal symbol, a warning to all who serve the powerful. It said, "Look, here is the man who gave everything to his master, his genius, his loyalty, his life, and this is his reward." This legend was a form of popular judgment against Justinian. It immortalized not only the deeds of Belisarius, but also the betrayal of his emperor. The ironic end to this story is that Justinian, so afraid of his general's fame, by his own actions created the myth that made Belisarius's name immortal and forever linked his own name not only with great achievements, but with the greatest ingratitude. He wanted to extinguish the star of Belisarius, but instead, he turned it into a supernova, whose tragic light shines through the millennia, at times outshining the luster of his own imperial crown. In the end, popular memory chose its hero, and it was not the emperor on the throne, but his blinded servant. Pardoned but broken, Belisarius lived the rest of his days in quiet obscurity. He died in March of 565. With his death, an entire era passed, the era of Rome's last desperate attempt to reclaim the world. And, as if by a final twist of fate, just 8 months after him, in November of the same year, his eternal master and rival, Emperor Justinian, also died. The two titans, whose destinies had been inextricably linked for nearly 40 years, left the stage almost simultaneously, leaving behind an empire that was glittering on the surface, but exhausted to its core by endless wars and plague. Belisarius's death was quiet and almost unnoticed. There was no grand funeral, no national mourning that would have undoubtedly accompanied his passing at the zenith of his fame. He died as a private citizen, leaving behind a vast fortune that, after his death, reverted to the treasury. His departure symbolically drew a line under Justinian's great dream. Without the sword of Belisarius, the empire could not only no longer conquer new lands, but it could not even hold what had been won. Just 3 years after Justinian's death, the Germanic tribe of the Lombards invaded Italy, the land Belisarius had fought for 20 years, and most of the peninsula was lost to Byzantium forever. Africa and Spain also gradually slipped from control. The grand project of Renovatio Imperii proved to be a colossus on feet of clay, and the death of its chief architect and its chief enforcer was the beginning of its end. Their joint departure closed a tragic circle. The emperor could not outlive his great servant, as if admitting that without him, his own reign lost its meaning and its brilliance. The legacy of Belisarius proved to be far more durable and multifaceted than his short-lived conquests. For military history, he remains one of the greatest commanders of all time, a master of tactics and strategy whose campaigns are studied in military academies to this day. He was the last in the line of great Roman generals, standing alongside Scipio, Marius, and Caesar. But his image extends far beyond military science. In culture and art, he became an archetype of the tragic hero, a symbol of loyalty betrayed by its master. His story, especially in its legendary form, inspired artists, writers, and playwrights for centuries, from medieval chroniclers to French Enlightenment philosophers and modern authors. The painting Belisarius Begging for Alms by Jacques-Louis David became one of the most famous works of neoclassicism, a powerful political statement about tyranny and the ingratitude of power. For historians, his figure remains a subject of endless debate. Was he truly the last Roman, a bearer of old republican virtues in an age of despotism? Or was he merely a product of his time, a brilliant but loyal tool in the hands of an ambitious emperor. His conquests, though they failed to restore the empire to its former borders for long, gave it one last, bright flash of glory, postponing its decline by several decades. But perhaps his most important legacy is not the lands he reclaimed, but the eternal lesson he taught. A lesson that, in a system built on the absolute power of one man, another's personal virtues, genius, popularity, even loyalty itself, can become not a reason for reward, but a death sentence. Belisarius remains through the ages as an eternal monument to this bitter truth. Now, having followed his entire path from a Thracian village to an imperial court, we can finally assemble all the pieces of the puzzle and give a comprehensive answer to the main question. Why? Why did Justinian destroy the man who gave him back an empire? The answer is as layered as a Byzantine intrigue. The blinding of Belisarius, whether real or metaphorical, was not a spontaneous act of mad cruelty. It was the logical, if monstrous, culmination of a years-long process, based not on one, but on several factors. First, fear. Justinian, as an autocrat, was pathologically afraid of anyone who could cast a shadow on his own authority. Belisarius was not just popular, he was adored by the army and the people. His fame was his own achievement, won on the battlefield, while Justinian's fame was derivative of his office. This contrast was unbearable for the emperor. Second, the very nature of power in Byzantium. The emperor was not just a ruler, he was God's anointed, the sole source of legitimacy and strength. Any subject who became too powerful and independent violated this sacred order. Belisarius, with his private army of bucellari and his ability to win wars even without the court's support, became such an anomaly, one the system had to either completely subjugate or destroy. Third, the psychology of Belisarius himself. His greatest virtue, absolute loyalty, became his fatal flaw. He did not understand the rules of the political game. He did not weave intrigues. He did not build a faction at court. He did not try to leverage his popularity into political capital. He was a soldier who believed in his oath. This naivety made him defenseless against his enemies. Thus, the paradox of his fate is resolved in a tragic formula. He was too great to remain a mere subject, but too loyal to become a usurper. He was stuck between these two roles, and the system, which abhors such anomalies, crushed him. Justinian destroyed him not because he was a traitor, but because he was not. And yet, he could have been. And that fear alone was enough. Ultimately, the story of Belisarius transcends the biography of one man and becomes a universal parable about the relationship between genius and power, between talent and envy. It is an eternal reminder that systems built on the concentration of power in one person's hands are organically intolerant of another, independent and brilliant star shining nearby. Power, by its nature, is jealous. It demands a monopoly not only on force, but on glory. A genius, especially a military one, creates an alternative center of gravity, an alternative source of loyalty, and thereby undermines the very foundations of absolutism. Belisarius was the perfect instrument for a grand dream, but his very perfection made him a threat to the dreamer. His tragedy is that of a tool that proved more perfect than its creator. He showed that one can conquer the world for a throne, but one cannot stop the throne from fearing the one capable of such conquests. The lesson of his life is bleak. In certain political systems, the greatest services to the state can become the gravest crimes in the eyes of the sovereign. And as long as absolute power exists, so too will that power's fear of the genius who might eclipse it. The legend of the blind general, begging for alms at the gates of the capital he saved, is not just a historical anecdote. It is an eternal symbol, carved into the memory of humanity, which asks us all an uncomfortable question. What is the true price of serving power? And is not the highest loyalty, in the eyes of a tyrant, merely treason, deferred? The answer to that question is rewritten, time and again, in the blood and tears of a nation's best.